Now, we are not 100% oil-free in this household. In fact, the thing that I probably most often use oil for is baked goods. Now, I personally like to use avocado oil. I buy this large one from Costco, and it lasts me probably a whole year because no matter how many recipes I've tried, I've just never found a really good substitute for that consistency that having oil in a baked good gives you. That being said, when I do want a healthier baked good option, the first thing I remove from a recipe is the oil. Oil is of course very high in fat. It is very calorie dense, which means that using even just a tiny amount is going to add a lot of extra calories to your recipe, and it just doesn't really provide any nutritional value whatsoever. So let's dive right in and talk about the different options for making your baked goods oil-free. First, finding an already oil-free recipe is probably going to be your best bet. These recipes have obviously been tried and tested and are likely pretty good as is. However, I can't always find the exact recipe that I'm looking for in an oil-free version. So for those recipes, I like to make them oil-free myself with just some easy substitution options. Now, sometimes these experiments turn out well and sometimes not, but I do just truly enjoy seeing how they go. If you are an experimental baker yourself, you know what I'm talking about. But for those who are more comfortable following a precise recipe, here are some general substitutions that you can make when swapping out oil. A super easy way is to actually replace it with a fruit puree. So you can use something like mashed banana or even applesauce. I personally prefer applesauce. I like to use the unsweetened variety because then it doesn't add any extra sweetness to the recipe. And I just find that the applesauce has a more neutral taste. It doesn't really alter the flavor of your recipe at all. And the general rule that I've read for an applesauce swap is to use 1/3 cup of applesauce for every half a cup of oil in a recipe. Another alternative to fruit puree is actually what we're going to use today, and that is pumpkin puree. So I do have leftover pumpkin from making all the yummy fall recipes recently, and this is a great way to use it up. You can of course also store it in the freezer, but I tend to forget about it in there, and then by the time I remember, it's not fall anymore. So let's instead just add it into some of our baked goods. And with pumpkin, I usually swap with a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning if the recipe calls for half a cup of oil, I will just use half a cup of pumpkin puree instead. Now recently, I've seen another swap option, and that is aquafaba. Now, if you're not familiar with aquafaba, it is basically the liquid left over in a can of chickpeas, or the cooking liquid if you make your own chickpeas at home. Now, I personally haven't really experimented with using this as a substitute for oil in baking, but I am intrigued because I have used it a lot as a substitute for oil in cooking. Actually, if you have any experiences you can share about using aquafaba in place of oil in a baked recipe, let us know in the comments. I personally would love to hear about it, and I'm sure others watching would as well. We are going to start with a recipe from It Doesn't Taste Like Chicken, and I have made this recipe many times before, always with oil, but it has always turned out great. I really love this recipe. So I thought, why not give it a try swapping the oil for pumpkin puree? So we are first going to start by preheating the oven to 350 degrees, and then we are going to measure out our flour. I personally like to use a scale. I just find you get a much better measurement that way. So even if a recipe gives the quantity in cups, I just convert it to grams. We will also need 3/4 cup of sugar, half a cup of cocoa powder, baking powder, and a pinch of salt. For the wet ingredients, we need 1 cup of milk and a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar. Now, the original recipe calls for half a cup of neutral oil, so we are just going to substitute that for half a cup of pumpkin puree. Then once that is very thoroughly mixed, we are gonna add the wet ingredients to the dry ingredients and just work very gently here. You don't wanna overmix the batter too much. Lastly, we're going to add in some vegan chocolate chips and then add the batter into our silicone muffin cups. Now, since it is just me and my husband here, I actually like to store most of my baked goods in the freezer, and that is because normally we will not eat a whole batch of muffins or cookies within a few days. So what I like to do is once everything has fully cooled, go ahead and add them to a Tupperware or a Ziploc bag and then to the freezer. So that way, whenever I'm in the mood for a chocolate muffin, I can just microwave and or toaster them. Actually, what I really like to do is to defrost them slightly in the microwave and then cut them in half and finish them off in the toaster. And that way you get a nice warm muffin with a little bit of crispiness on the edges. To use up the rest of our pumpkin puree, we are going to make a recipe that is already oil-free, so no substitutions needed. We are going to make a pumpkin loaf, and it is still technically fall for a couple more weeks, so I think we are safe to make one more pumpkin loaf of the season. For this loaf, I'm going to use a recipe from Kathy's Vegan Kitchen, and we are actually going to start by putting our parchment paper into our baking dish. Now here's my little tip for parchment paper. It helps a lot if you crumple it into a ball first. You can even get it wet if needed, and that'll just help it sit in the pan a little bit more easily. Now the recipe says to first measure out your non-dairy milk, add your 1/4 teaspoon of lemon juice, and then whisk it until bubbly. So I just gave it a little extra frothing action, nothing too crazy. Now we're gonna need a fair bit of pumpkin puree for this recipe since it is a pumpkin loaf. I'm just measuring out 15 ounces. Now the original recipe calls for either brown sugar or coconut sugar here. I wanted to keep it on the healthy side, so I decided to use coconut sugar, but I only had a 1/2 cup, so I am substituting the other half with maple sugar flakes, which is basically just dehydrated maple syrup, but this is really good for baking. And then to that we'll just add our maple syrup and vanilla extract. Now in another bowl, we will need 2 cups of flour and a lot of spices. Actually, when I first saw this recipe, I thought this is way too much spice, but I'm just gonna follow it and see how it turns out. The recipe calls for 2 tablespoons of pumpkin pie spice, as well as an extra teaspoon of nutmeg. And lastly, just a bit of baking soda and baking powder. Of course, don't forget to add your plant milk into the wet ingredients. And then lastly, the dry into the wet. Again, we don't want to overmix here, so stir until just combined. And this will bake at 350 for 1 hour. Now this turned out pretty well. I think the only thing I would adjust for next time is to reduce the spice amounts just a little bit because I did find it pretty well spiced. But overall, it's a pretty good little loaf. Even my husband, who right before I made this swore he doesn't even like anything pumpkin, thought it was a pretty good loaf. And lastly, we are going to make an oil-free cookie. Now, I have read up a bit on oil-free baking, and Brandy from the Vegan 8 says that any cookies made without some kind of fat source, such as like nut butter, are going to turn out more like a muffin than like a cookie. And after making these, I can definitely understand that statement. So I've only started to experiment with butter swaps for cookies. I did try beans once, and that was interesting. So I thought for today, we better go with a tried and true recipe, something that is already oil-free. We are going to make snickerdoodles from the Fat-Free Vegan. So for this recipe, we are just going to start by making a flax egg. Now, if you don't have flax, I've also heard that ground chia seeds can make a good substitute for this. And we'll just set that aside to gel. Meanwhile, we will get together our cinnamon sugar topping. For the cookies, we will need 1 1/4 cups flour, cane sugar, and brown sugar, but I actually reduced the sugar quantity, so I'll leave that alteration in the description box down below. Of course, cinnamon, and I did a pinch of pumpkin pie spice as well, baking powder, baking soda, and a pinch of salt. For the wet ingredients, we will need plant milk, lemon juice or apple cider vinegar. We will also add in some vanilla extract and maple syrup. And lastly, just add your wet ingredients to your dry ingredients. Do not forget your flax egg. And combine that until there's no more dry bits in the dough. Now, my dough turned out a bit sticky. I probably could have added a bit more flour, but I just didn't want to mess with the consistency at all. So I decided instead of rolling mine into balls, which is what the original recipe says to do, I just used a little scooper and spooned out small little balls onto the parchment paper and sprinkled the cinnamon sugar on top afterwards. And then into the oven at 350 for about 8 to 10 minutes. Now mine puffed up and expanded a little bit, so just make sure you're leaving enough room between each cookie before you bake them. These definitely turned out more cakey and muffiny than a regular cookie, but I actually think for a snickerdoodle, the consistency works pretty well. And once again, they are husband approved because Q just had some and said they're delicious. And honestly, he's kind of picky with his baked goods, so that's a pretty good endorsement. Now, if you were hoping for a brownie recipe in today's video, I have got you covered because I recently made one of the best oil-free brownies I have ever had, and I actually use a sneaky substitute for the oil that I didn't even mention in today's video. So if you want want that recipe, check out this squash video right here. There are also a bunch of other delicious squash recipes in there. I think you'll really like it. And with that, I hope you guys enjoyed. Let's eat plants, and I'll see you guys next time.